I saw this post right here on Twitter and it scared me. Just a little bit of context if you're not from Canada. Calgary is one of the first cities that mountain melt actually hits, meaning if they're low in water, be assured that the rest of Canada also is going to be struggling to get water. For the water apocalypse that is 2024, I'm going to tell you what kinds of water you can use when it comes to wastewater, rainwaters, and where you can use it. I know that sounds really weird, but there's a big difference between root vegetables, regular vegetables, and flowers as to which one of these waters you should be using, because it can be life or death in some cases. Another thing that we'll be looking at is actually what studies have shown in regards to using wastewater. And it's quite interesting, to be honest, how that kind of all plays out. Okay, so method number one is obviously rainwater. And there are a million different ways you can capture this, whether it's putting it underneath an eaves trough, redirecting an eaves trough with kind of this really cool device up there off of Amazon. And when it comes to rainwater, you can use this anywhere. You can use it with vegetables, root veg, regular veg, flowers, lawns, shrubbery, and perennials. So rainwater, there's no real warnings, but gray water, aka wastewater, there are a little bit different rules that apply. So wastewater is defined as essentially anything that comes out of a tap and then gets put into our sewage drain. So this can include pasta water, pierogi water for us in Saskatchewan, bath water, shower water, brushing teeth water, cleaning water, laundry water, and even toilet bowl water, which we will do a complete separate section on that. The results and what I say may surprise you or shock you. Maybe to some of you it won't. To many of you, it's going to gross you out. Okay, so when we're talking about this form of wastewater, there are two big warnings. Number one, wherever you have organics, you have the potential for viruses and bacterias, bottom line. So if you are sensitive to any sort of issue like that, if you are immune deficient, probably not in your best interest to go this route, particularly with things like pasta water, the pierogi water, that sort of thing. Laundry water is a little bit different, but those ones definitely steer away from if you're immune compromised. The other one is actually the attraction to rodents and or insects. So it's a pretty blanket term as to what is attracted. You could get rats, you could get raccoons, you could get mice, you could get nothing. And then on the bug world, you could just end up with fungus gnats at most, or you can end up with something a little bit more invasive and dangerous to your garden plants, which obviously less than ideal. What is the best water you can use in your setup? First off, when it comes to tap water, and this is a question I get so often, and I could do a whole video just on tap water and chloramine and chlorine and all that sort of stuff. Let me know in the comments down below if you want to see that, because I can most definitely do it. But number one, when we're talking about wastewater specifically, is what kind of wastewater you have. So there are two options. Option number one is water softened. The option number two is not water softened. So if you have a water softener, the water that comes out is relatively higher in salt than your regular tap water is. And what these salts tend to do over time, not on the first application, but over time, what tends to happen is it tightens soil. So it kind of brings everything together in a tight weave, if you will, which prevents water from penetrating. So water will pool and it very often will run off. Obviously, the water, when it runs off, is taking soil with it, which number one is not good. Number two, in a drought system or a drought season, water that doesn't penetrate is less than ideal, obviously. So there are two solutions to this. Solution number one is actually diluting the softened water with rainwater. So that goes back to what I was saying about capturing rainwater and the benefits to that. Well, if you do a 50-50 split between your softened tap water and your rainwater, you're going to be in a better circumstance than if you were to just water with softened tap water. Makes sense? Great. The other option is to actually use gypsum. So it kind of truly depends on how long you've been doing this for and how much gypsum you want to add. You can't add too much other than what it will do to your bank account, if that makes sense. So very rarely could you overdo it with gypsum, particularly in a system that is not enclosed. So inside of a container, for example, we're talking in-ground raised beds, that sort of thing. And so when it comes to determining the application, it can be anywhere from 1/2 pound to 1/4 pound per square foot. You can use your own discretion with this. If you've just put a water softener in, you just started gardening and your soil hasn't been, watered profusely with this, it might be okay to put 1/4 pound in. If you are in a scenario where you've been using water softener for 2 decades, you might want to go with 1/2 pound, particularly if you are seeing issues with water pooling and lack of water penetration. So when you go to dig your soil profiles, like I've taught you to do before, and you go to do a percolation test and it's very slow at percolating, and or the lower profiles actually look like they don't have any water in them, probably time to add some gypsum. And to do this properly, I would advise tilling, whether that's with a machine or just a double dig with a shovel, something that's going to incorporate it particularly into kind of that top layer that we need the water to penetrate into. Because once it's in, as long as it's not running off, physics can do the rest. Okay, so before we get into the gross stuff that is toilet bowl water, let's talk about washing water first. Okay. Washing water. This is referencing laundry water, shower water, bath water, and cleaning water. So, of course, you can get biodegradable soaps for all of these options. And biodegradable soap isn't what we all think it is. So the definition for biodegradable soap and what can be defined as a biodegradable soap is something that splits into 90% of it splits into water, carbon dioxide, and organic material. The rest of it technically could be things like fragrance, for example. Now, with that being said, ultimately speaking, it's probably going to serve like a similar purpose to just like a regular stripped down version of a chemical formula, because when you really break down like different washing types of products, they all kind of come out the same in the wash, if you will, in regards to like how they interact with the world around it. Okay, so issue number 1 with using cleaning products is chlorine. So no, not all products contain chlorine in it. However, some do. Now, there are things you can use or do to ensure that the wastewater that has that chlorine in it can be reused with your plants. And that is putting it in a bucket and then leaving it outside for the day, because chlorine gases off very easily. Chloramide does not. And that's a whole other discussion, because cities actually, some of them, mine included, use chloramide. Different discussion, but chlorine does gas off. So within 24 hours, that container is fine to apply to your plant. Okay, the next ingredient that you may or may not see inside of your cleaning product, and I would say this is more common than the chlorine product is, and that is boron. So if you did not know, boron is AKA borax, and I've done a video on actually applying borax to your garden because that was a question that people wanted myth busted. And yes, boron is one of the 17 essential nutrients, meaning it is essential to plant growth. Now, with that being said, it is a micronutrient of the 17 essentials, meaning a little bit goes a heck of a long way, and if you overdo it, plant game over. I would go for boron free whenever possible. It's very unlikely you are low in boron, if you will, and or follow the same rules that applied to softened water, and that is to dilute it with rainwater and or tap water that is not gray water that contains boron, if that makes sense, or gray water that does not contain boron. So for example, if you have a laundry detergent that contains boron, but you also have another bucket of wash water where your shampoo came from, that does not have boron. So you could put those two together and then water accordingly and you will be okay. The other rule to kind of feel out whether or not you want to go this direction, it's to determine what your soil system is. So if you are on the gate crew and you've been following this channel for a while, you know that the container, in my mind, is part of the soil system. So whether that is a clay pot, a plastic pot, a fabric pot, whatever the case is, I consider that a part of the soil system. And if you are in an enclosed soil system, so plastic, terracotta, fabric, you name it, I would lean even farther into not using it and or diluting it, because that is a closed soil system. If you have a raised bed that is connected to the earth, if you have an in-ground bed that is connected to the earth, those products or those soil systems, you could use boron or softened water with less guilt, if you will. So definitely something to think about there. Okay, so the other thing that we tend to see in our cleaning products, again, laundry, shower, bath, dishes, you name it, that is phosphates. So if you did not know this, soaps are mostly made out of organic ingredients. Sounds bizarre, but it's true. And phosphates, if you are at all a plant nerd, you know that that is a fertilizer. So this is where we look at the actual studies of how using gray wastewater can or may or may not benefit your plants. And in this case, the addition of phosphate could, most likely will, work in your favor so that you actually don't have to steer away from. It's free fertilizer. Now, with all of these products, regardless of what's in them, don't put them on the leaves, just in case the chlorine wasn't entirely gassed off, in case there is something really bizarre in there that, again, won't hurt you or your plants or your soil, but could potentially just do something weird to the leaves. Try to, when using wastewater, apply it to the roots. So if this means using like a gravity-fed irrigation system, which I'll do a video on that because I just set that up and I love it. I love it. I didn't know it was a thing until literally this year, and I've convinced myself the whole garden needs to be gravity fed now. My poor bank account, but regardless. Okay, so the other thing to consider is the organic stuff. Now, we're not going to talk about toilet bowl yet. That's going to be at the end of this. But what I will talk about is like pierogi and pasta water, for example. So something that was utilized, a fish tank also would fall kind of under this category. So anything that was used to boil or use in food production, if you will, this will contain organic materials. Now, that wastewater in particular should be used immediately. The longer you allow it to sit in the water and ferment, the more dangerous it becomes in regards to bacteria in particular that could be harmful to you, to your plants, to pets, that sort of thing. So whenever you're using pasta water, for example, let it cool off, go and apply it to your soil ASAP, like that night type thing. Okay, so the other factor that this often looks at is pH. Now, most wastewater, like in general that has been looked at, it has a higher pH, meaning it's higher than what we would want with plants. But this is so variable because, for example, where I am, the pH of our water out of the tap straight up is 8, which is high to begin with. So I don't know if this is really going to play into your decision. It could. You could test it if you wanted. I personally really like the Rappy test kit or the Root Farm test kit. The reason I say that is because it's so easy to use. It's used for hydroponics, but guys, it's going to work for just like regular containers of water as well. Okay, so what does the science? That is such a bad term now. It's got an ick feel. Study this stuff. That's a better look at it. Just don't mind me while I hike these babies up. Okay. I'm gonna leave that in. Editing Ashley, leave that in because that's funny. That is me in public all the time. My poor friends and family that have to hang out with me in public. Okay, so I have 3 studies that I'm referencing. And that is because I could reference a bunch of them. And the beauty of gray wastewater or gray water is that there is approximately an answer that will support your conclusion, regardless of what it is. So these studies, there's studies to support it being awesome. There are studies to support it not being awesome. So I'm going to give you kind of like an overview of what I found, and then you can determine if it's for you or not. And to be honest, the general look at this, there are some that are some cases where it would be beneficial and some cases where it would not. Okay, so one of the studies used tap water, gray water collected on a Monday and then stored throughout the week, but not pasteurized. And then the third group was pasteurized gray water used the day of sanitation. So pasteurizing, if you did not know, is what we do with, for example, milk. And it essentially is heating up the liquid to the point that it kills off any harmful bacteria. So they had one that was not pasteurized and then allowed to sit, one that was a pasteurized and then immediately used after being pasteurized. And then they had one that was not pasteurized, but also was not allowed to ferment over time and was used immediately that day. Okay, so the highlights that we care about is that products number 1, which is tap water, and number 3, which is pasteurized and used immediately, actually had the best in height. So if your goal is more vegetative growth, more greenery, more vine, that sort of thing, 1 and 3 might be the route you want to go with. Now, number 3 is going to be a little bit harder to do because you're going to have to somehow heat your gray water, which wouldn't be an issue in the case of like pasta or pierogies, for example, but would be an issue in like, say, your bath water. Number 2 was actually how long it took for the plant to sprout. So in this case, we were looking at beans very specifically, and the first one, number 1, which is regular tap water, actually caused them to bloom and set seed the fastest. And then the one that took the longest, shockingly enough, was number 2. So the reason for the delayed response actually came down to the fact that the water with organic matter in it was allowed to sit for an entire week, which caused it to ferment, which in turn caused some degradation and decomposition, which in turn released more nutrients. So when we look at, for example, a compost tea, the reason why that is better than just throwing compost in water and then applying it to the plants is because if it's allowed to ferment or digest some of that nutrients via bacteria, it's more bioavailable, meaning that the plant can then uptake it much, much easier. And unfortunately, in this case, because the number 2 was fermented wastewater, we very likely had a higher volume of nitrogen in probably several different forms in the nitrogen cycle, which just translates into more accessible uptake for the plants once it's applied. Now, this is oftentimes a bad thing when we're talking about plants that we want to fruit and flower, and that is because nitrogen does tend to encourage more green foliage growth. Now, for example, if you had like a creeping Jenny or a hosta perennial garden, that might be a good thing. So depending on what you're going for, fermenting your wastewater could work in your favor, or it could work against you if you were using it with tomatoes. Okay, so then the other study I looked at, actually, it didn't show much, which I find so interesting that it's kind of all over the map, which is why I said you can find answers to support whatever you think is the answer, unfortunately. So the other one I looked at actually determined that there was 0 increase in biomass regardless of what was used. Now, they didn't use a fermented wastewater, so maybe that was the downfall of this study and being able to compare it against the others. So it is an apples versus oranges comparison. However, no biomass increase in either the roots and or upper biomass, so it was lower in general across the board. What they did notice, though, is a change in CEC, which is a fancy word for cation exchange capacity, which is a fancy word for the battery reserve of your soil and the ability for your soil to hold on to nutrients in particular. And then also an increase in pH, which coincides with just irrigation in general, in my humble opinion. Irrigation tends to alkalize soil. And I'm not saying that this was, this increase was because the ground was under irrigation to begin with. They don't actually indicate in the study what that ground was used for previous. However, for it to increase within a season is concerning and something to think about. It didn't increase hugely, but if you already have an alkaline soil, meaning you are in the prairies, then it may come into factor into whether or not you decide to use wastewater and where you choose to use it, because your soil very likely is already alkaline. Okay, so let's get into the toilet products now. Okay, so we have a number 1 and we have a number 2. First off, I will say right off the bat, number 2 should never, ever, 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 ever be used in your garden. People do it, but they know what they're doing. And so as a general statement, please, for the love of God, don't, because it can be incredibly dangerous and humans are disgusting. So any medication you have will end up in your garden. Any sort of high concentration of some bizarre chemical from your brewskis over the weekend will end up in your garden. Just don't use it, please. It's not for me. Now, the other version, the yellow let it mellow version of this, I did a whole video on it. So if you want to learn more on how the whole world of urine works, things you may want to consider, which includes actually fermenting it, then you want to check out this video right here. Thank you for watching. I'll talk to you guys next time. Bye.